Let's imagine this. A monster hunter arrives in a village where absolutely nobody wants to see him. You look up, and the sky looks like it woke up in a bad mood. You look around, and half the village is probably cursed, while the other half is very clearly hiding something. And before nightfall, this man is somehow going to uncover a tragic family secret, fight a creature that probably shouldn't exist, get blamed for problems he didn't cause, receive less money than he was promised, and still end up sitting across from some random merchant treating a card game like the fate of the entire world depends on it. That is the magic of The Witcher 3. This is a game where the main story tells you Ciri is in danger. The wild hunt is coming. The fate of the world is at stake. And 5 minutes later, you're helping some random old lady recover a frying pan like it's a matter of national security, and somehow it works. The Witcher 3 isn't remembered simply because it's big. A lot of games are big. Some maps are so massive that they feel less like an adventure and more like an unpaid internship. The Witcher is remembered because almost everything in its world feels like it has a story behind it. A village isn't just a village, a contract isn't just a fight. A monster isn't always the real monster. And sometimes a side quest hits harder than the entire main story of another game. That's why people are still talking about The Witcher 3 all these years later, and it's not because the game is perfect, because it absolutely isn't. Geralt sometimes moves like his legs are receiving conflicting instructions. Roach has the survival instincts of a chair, and the candles in this game are somehow more dangerous than half the monsters. But when The Witcher works, it does something very few open-world games manage to do. It makes you care. At the center of The Witcher 3, the story is actually pretty simple. It's just Geralt looking for Ciri. Not a magical artifact. Not the throne of some kingdom. Not a treasure chest containing a pair of boots that gives him 3% more damage. He's just looking for someone he loves, and that makes the entire story feel personal. Yes, there are kingdoms, wars, prophecies, ancient powers, giant monsters, and names that sometimes sound like somebody dropped a spoon on a keyboard. But at the heart of the story is family. Geralt isn't trying to become some legendary hero. Honestly, most of the time, he looks like he'd rather take a nap than get involved in politics. He's tired, he's sarcastic, and he always seems one conversation away from saying, "I am definitely not getting paid enough for this." But when it comes to Ciri, everything changes. That emotional core is what gives the main story its weight. You want to find Ciri not just because the game tells you to. You want to find her because you understand what she means to Geralt. The funny thing is, the game constantly reminds you that the situation is urgent, but the world is so full of distractions that you spend most of the game completely ignoring that urgency. Ciri is being hunted by an army of supernatural riders. Meanwhile, you're standing in a cave thinking, wait, can I loot that barrel? This is modern heroism priorities. And the real magic of The Witcher 3 is that the side quests rarely feel like side quests. In a lot of games, optional content is basically a boring chore wearing a fantasy costume. Collect 10 herbs, kill 5 wolves. Deliver this letter, and congratulations, you are now slightly richer and emotionally exactly as depressed as you were before. The Witcher usually doesn't work like that. Here, a tiny quest can begin with a simple problem and somehow end with a curse, a betrayal, a dead child, a broken family, or a decision that makes you pause the game and stare at the wall like you just received terrible news in real life. The Bloody Baron storyline is probably the perfect example. It isn't famous because it's fun in the traditional sense, it's famous because it's uncomfortable. The Baron isn't presented as a simple villain, he's violent, guilty, pathetic, broken, and painfully human. The game doesn't ask you to like him. It asks you to understand how ugly a person can become and how suffering doesn't automatically make someone innocent. And somehow, all of this exists in the same game where you can also spend 30 minutes searching for better pants or hunting down the perfect Gwent card so you can basically bet your grandmother's house at the next tavern you find. That's what separates The Witcher 3 from so many other open worlds. Its best quests aren't built around rewards, they're built around consequences. Sometimes you make a decision and feel pretty good about yourself. Sometimes you make a decision and feel like the smartest person in the entire village, and sometimes the game comes back 5 hours later and says, "Hey, remember that decision? Yeah, well, it was terrible, thanks Witcher." Exactly what I needed after a long day at work. A reminder that apparently I make terrible decisions in video games too. The Witcher understands something very important. Monsters are more interesting when they aren't just monsters. Geralt is supposed to hunt creatures for money. That's the job. Someone sees a beast. they panic, they call the white-haired professional. And then, when the job is done, they try to pay him with pocket lint and village gratitude. But the game constantly complicates that simple idea. Sometimes the creature is dangerous, but it only exists because of human cruelty. Sometimes the monster is just defending itself. Sometimes the villagers are hiding the truth. And sometimes everyone involved is so horrible that you start thinking maybe the swamp should just keep the entire village. That moral grayness is one of the biggest reasons so many people connect with this game. The Witcher isn't interested in clean decisions. It rarely says, here's the good option, and here is the evil option. Instead, it usually gives you two terrible choices and politely waits for you to ruin somebody's life. And because of that, every monster contract feels like a small investigation. You arrive, you talk to people, you follow tracks. You examine bodies, you use your Witcher senses. And little by little, you discover that the real story is usually worse than the monster itself. And that's the point. In this world, evil doesn't always have claws. Sometimes it has a title, a uniform, an important last name, or just a really confident excuse. Geralt himself is one of the biggest reasons the game works. He isn't loud, he isn't dramatic. He doesn't walk into every room giving speeches about destiny. Most of the time, Geralt looks like he wants the conversation to end before it even begins, and somehow he's still fascinating. His legendary, basically covers his entire emotional range. Suspicious? Annoyed? Deep philosophical judgment about the nature of humanity? Also, this man can react to a supernatural murder mystery with the same energy most people use to check if their soup is warm enough. But underneath that dry voice and permanently exhausted expression, Geralt cares. He cares about Ciri. He cares about his friends. He cares about innocent people, even when he pretends he doesn't. And that contrast makes him feel real. He isn't a perfect hero. He's a professional living in a world that constantly makes professionalism almost impossible. Just imagine his average day. People insult him, they underpay him, they lie to him, they send him into swamps, ghosts attack him. And somehow, he still gets blamed for things he didn't even do. Honestly, I wouldn't blame him if one day he just gave up and opened a quiet little bakery in Toussaint. Although knowing Geralt, someone would eventually walk in and say, "The bread is cursed," and he would just sigh. The world of The Witcher 3 isn't beautiful in a clean, perfect way. It's beautiful in a way that tells you this place has suffered. Velen feels like misery somehow learned how to grow between the grass. Mud, war, hunger, death, and villages where nobody looks like they've had a good night's sleep since childhood. Novigrad feels alive but never safe. It's a city filled with people, politics, religion, corruption, and strangers who smile at you like they already stole your wallet. Then you have Skellige, and Skellige feels completely different. Cold islands, mountains, ships, clans, honor. And people who probably solve arguments by punching a tree until the tree apologizes. Every region has its own identity. You aren't just moving from one biome to another, you're moving from one mood to another. Velen drains you. Novigrad overwhelms you. Skellige awakens your inner Viking. And then there's Toussaint in Blood and Wine. Toussaint feels like a vacation brochure written by someone who forgot to mention the vampires. And that is why this open world works. It isn't just big, it's memorable. You see an abandoned village and you want to know what happened there. You find a letter and suddenly you're following someone else's story. You enter a cave looking for loot and somehow leave with emotional damage, and yes, the map has way too many question marks, especially in Skellige. At some point, the ocean starts looking like someone spilled punctuation marks all over it. But even then, the game constantly gives you reasons to be curious. The Witcher 3 is incredible, but it isn't untouchable. One of the most common criticisms is the combat. Some players enjoy it because it fits the fantasy of being a Witcher. Preparing oils, drinking potions, using signs, dodging, attacking, and surviving. Other players think it feels stiff, repetitive, or simply not as deep as the writing surrounding it. And honestly, both sides are kind of right. The combat isn't terrible. It works. But nobody finished The Witcher 3 and said, "Man, that dodge roll changed my life." The combat is the vehicle. The story is the destination. Movement is another story. Sometimes Geralt controls like a legendary monster hunter with decades of experience. Other times he controls like a shopping cart with trauma. You try to loot a chest and Geralt lights a candle. You try again? Another candle. By the end of the game, Geralt has accidentally lit more candles than some churches. And then we have Roach. Roach isn't just a horse. Roach is a magical transportation theory that occasionally works. You call her and she appears behind you, on top of a hill, inside a fence, or in a location that makes you seriously question the laws of physics. Roach isn't broken. She simply operates on a higher plane of stupidity. But strangely enough, those flaws became part of the game's charm. People complain about them. Sure, but people also remember them. The Witcher 3 is imperfect, but it's imperfect in a strangely human way. The pacing of The Witcher 3 is also hilarious when you think about it, because the story is incredibly urgent, but the player almost never experiences that urgency. Ciri is in danger. The Wild Hunt is moving. The world is unstable. And Geralt of Rivia, legendary Witcher, professional monster slayer and father figure, is sitting in a tavern losing his dignity to a random merchant with a better deck. And that is Gwent. What started as a simple minigame somehow became an addiction. Some people started playing The Witcher 3 expecting to experience one of the greatest RPG stories ever made, and ended up thinking, okay cool, but where do I get more spy cards? Gwent is the perfect symbol of this entire game. The main story says, go save Ciri. The world says, sure, but first, would you like to become emotionally invested in a fictional card game? And you do. Of course you do. That's why the pacing problem also becomes part of the charm. The game gives you urgency, but it also gives you a world so interesting that ignoring that urgency becomes part of the experience. The expansions are another reason The Witcher 3 became such a legend. Hearts of Stone is darker, more focused, and filled with unforgettable characters. It feels like a cruel fairy tale, the kind where every wish comes with a knife hidden behind its back. Blood and Wine feels completely different. It's brighter, more colorful, almost peaceful at first. Toussaint looks like exactly the kind of place where Geralt should finally be allowed to relax. Beautiful vineyards, warm sunlight, elegant castles, and then the game reminds you this is still The Witcher. So obviously something horrible is waiting underneath all that beauty. What makes these expansions so special is that they never feel like leftovers. They feel like complete stories. They have their own tone, their own characters, their own identity. A lot of games sell extra content that feels like somebody swept the cutting room floor and turned whatever they found into a download button. The Witcher 3 gave us expansions that actually felt generous. And after spending so much time surrounded by mud, war, death, and misery, Blood and Wine feels like a farewell, not a perfectly happy ending, but something close to peace, which for Geralt is basically a miracle. In the end, The Witcher 3 works because it feels like a journey that gets messier, more complicated, and more personal the longer it goes on. Not everything is perfect. Sometimes Geralt fights more candles than monsters. Roach appears in places that suggest she fundamentally misunderstood physics, and the combat doesn't always reach the same level as the game's best stories, but none of that erases what really matters. This is a game that pulls you into its world and slowly makes you want to stay there. You begin with one clear mission: find Ciri. But along the way, you meet broken people, forgotten villages, uncomfortable decisions, extremely weird monster contracts, and way too many games of Gwent for someone who is supposedly in a hurry. And maybe that's why The Witcher 3 is still so special, because it doesn't just take you toward an ending. It makes you enjoy everything that happens before you get there, especially when you get completely lost along the way. And with that, that's all for today. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more content like this. It also helps support the channel, and I really appreciate it. And I'll see you in the next one.